Good morning, folks. Thank you as ever for tuning into the News at Ben. Now, you might have heard this week that Lord Hermer described those of us who would like to leave the European Convention of Human Rights as being fascists, as being Nazis, I think is what he likened us to. And of course, as with so many things that come out of this Labour government, the opposite is the truth. And so I just wanted to talk, at least initially, a little bit about the European Convention of Human Rights and how it's changed. Now, the European Convention, as I'm sure all of you know, was set up in the aftermath of World War II when it was felt that belligerent states across Europe needed to be held to some accountability when it came to human rights for obvious reasons, given what happened during the war. And it started as a convention, as the name suggests, and the willing cooperation amongst its members to do what's right by humanity. And it has 17 or 18 conventions, none of which were laws, they were just conventions, as I say. And the European Court of Human Rights wasn't set up until 1959. And that convention worked quite well. The adjudications from the European Court were advisory, and member states could decide whether or not to take them up. And it worked basically on the principle that if you didn't adhere to what the European Court adjudicated, you were effectively named and shamed. But that was the only force that court had. And then in 1995, things changed. The European Convention was rewritten, something called Protocol 11 was adopted, in which it became a requirement for members of the European Convention of Human Rights to make the European Court its most superior court when it came to the adjudication of human rights laws in their own countries, and in effect required member states to adopt the European Convention itself into the body of laws within their country. And this came into effect in 1998, and at the same time Tony Blair adopted the European Convention into UK domestic law through the Human Rights Act at that time. And things changed dramatically thereafter. And I think one of the best bits of evidence for that is if you look at the number of rulings from the European Court of Human Rights between 1959 and 1998, when it adopted this forceful position that it held in member states, there were about 850 adjudications. And since 1998, so over that nearly 40-year period, there were 850 adjudications. And in the last 27 years, we've had something like 25,000 adjudications, 850 odd in the 40 years to 1998, and 25,000 in the period since 1998. Effectively, with its newfound power and authority, the European Court has gone mad. And it's for this reason, in significant part, that people like me wish to leave the European Convention of Human Rights and rip up its effect in domestic law, which in our case would mean ripping up the Human Rights Act. It has nothing to do with a desire to remove rights from humanity within the United Kingdom. It has everything to do with removing a court which is not accountable to the British people, which sits outside the UK, making law that affects us. And what's interesting, I think, as well about this is that the Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights requires that people are governed democratically. And there could be nothing more undemocratic than a supranational court which has no democratic mandate, holding sway within democratic nation states, which is precisely what the European Convention of Human Rights now does through its European Court. What was set up to protect human rights has come in effect to stand against some fundamental aspects of it. And the other reason, there's a multitude of reasons why people like me are against it, but the other significant reason that I'm at least against it is that when we adopted the European Convention of Human Rights into British domestic law, effectively what we did was to set aside what it meant to be British. By adopting this universal approach to rights, we removed, at the same time, the privileges of being a British citizen. And that's why we so often now find that our courts will find in favour of foreigners, in favour of illegal migrants, for example, at the cost of British civil society. Everyone is equal through the European Convention of Human Rights, as would have been natural in the 1950s, 60s and 70s and 80s, when it was just a convention, we were following it. But it has a completely different effect when you make it a law in your own country and you empower the court. You're basically making all humanity equal to British citizenry. And that is fundamentally anti-nation state. It's fundamentally anti-democratic. So you've got two very significant anti-democratic moves, if you like, taking place through the European Convention of Human Rights in domestic British law. It's the application of these conventions as law, which removes our citizenry, which removes the rights that we have effectively as a democratic state, and it's the imposition of a foreign court's supremacy without any democratic mandate, which in itself is a breach of human rights. So when Lord Hermer describes those of us who wish to remove it as being fascist, he's being disingenuous, because as a lawyer, he must know what I've just described. It is the imposition of the European Convention of Human Rights that is in itself anti-democratic and has become, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's fascist, but anything that moves away from democracy is heading in the direction of fascism. And so the European Convention is not working the way it was intended, and it must therefore be removed. And it is significantly as a result of the application of the European Convention in domestic law through the Human Rights Act that I think those that govern us, politicians in this country and those that govern us, can't find the right balance between the protection and promotion of British civil society, British citizenry on the one hand, and foreigners on the other, indeed including people who are trying to come to this country illegally. And let's just look at that for a second. We've lost the ability to enforce our borders because we're affording the same rights and protections to those who are seeking to enter the country illegally as we do to those who have British citizenry and are part of our civil society. In seeking to enforce our borders, the argument goes, we might compromise the physical welfare of people trying to break into the country, and therefore we mustn't enforce our borders. Indeed, we've gone so far as to provide a taxi service for them to British shores, put them in 4-star hotels, and you know the rest of the story. And it is through this Human Rights Act, through the belief, the mistaken belief that everyone in the United Kingdom should be treated exactly the same way, that we are unable to run our country for the benefit of British citizens. In other words, we are economically defeating democracy, culturally defeating democracy through the Human Rights Act. We would give succour to people who are coming to this country illegally, and we would give succour to foreigners over and above, and if necessary, to the detriment of British citizens. The Human Rights Act is at the heart of all of this, and it didn't surprise me this week to see, in fact I've known for some time, that we're spending £7 to £8 billion a year on benefits for over 1 million foreigners in the United Kingdom. It's entirely to be expected if you regard everyone in the United Kingdom as being equal. Of course, to anyone with an ounce of common sense, that makes no sense, because you should be providing benefits only to those who need it in their hour of need in the United Kingdom, who are British citizens, people who are paying into the tax net. They're the ones who should then benefit from the social welfare safety net that we provide. You pay taxes, you get the protection of the state. But we've taken a different approach. We're spending 7 to 8 billion a year on foreigners for benefits. And by the way, that figure is a very conservative figure. In my mind, it's probably more than that, but that's the published figure. And don't forget that we're spending something of a similar amount of money, something similar to that, on illegal migrants in the country. We're spending about 15, 16 billion a year minimum on foreigners, on benefits for foreigners and for housing and caring for illegal migrants in the United Kingdom. An absolute staggering amount of money. And again, this goes to the heart of why the Human Rights Act needs to go. And that brings me neatly, if not somewhat irritatingly, perhaps to some of you who are listening, to Farage's policy last week. Now, you might recall that there was a press conference that Reform held on Tuesday last week, just after the bank holiday, in which Farage declared that in government, Reform would remove the benefits cap, which is at effectively 2 children at the moment. And I can't think of a more daft policy to come out of Reform. And here's why. The problem with the birth rate in this country isn't of people who are effectively on benefits having children. The problem with procreation, for want of a better word, in the United Kingdom, and indeed across Western countries, is in the white working class majority who are struggling to make ends meet, husband and wife, both partners, out at work, unable to make enough money to justify having children and all the help that's required to go with children because both of them are working. By removing the cap on child benefit, effectively what Farage is doing, what Reform is doing, is encouraging that part of the country that is already, frankly, procreating perfectly happily, to have more children, and is encouraging people who are out of work to have more children. That is not good culturally or economically for the country. The people who need a break are the working class. Reform says it stands for the working class. Well, it is the working class who need a break, not people who are on benefits. And the way you give the working class a break is by reducing their tax burden. So I fully support tax relief for couples who have children, tax relief for couples who are married, create a family, and work towards the creation of family, community, and therefore nation state. They all go seamlessly hand in hand. That is joined up thinking. But in a country where we're already spending 7 or 8 billion a year on 1 million foreigners claiming benefits, there can be no room for removing the benefits cap on the number of children that people have. It'll encourage bad behavior. And the other thing that Reform, well, at least it used to stand for this when I was part of Reform, was the reintroduction of aspiration into society, the removal of the dependency culture. And I can't see any route to improving people's aspiration, people's belief that they can actually make for themselves that which they wish to by hard work and endeavor, by rewarding those on benefits. It simply doesn't make any sense. If Reform stands for the working class, then it is those who are working that need the benefit, not those who are already on benefits. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But I tell you what's really interesting, and I don't know if you've noticed this as I've gone through this morning's broadcast. The root of all of these problems, even though we've talked about benefits, we've talked about the need for tax cuts, we've talked about the inability to enforce borders, the preparedness to set aside the interests of British citizenry and civil society in favour of foreigners and so on. All of this comes together, all of it, under the umbrella of the domestic application of the European Convention of Human Rights. All of it leads back to that. When you look at the organism, again, for want of a better word, but when you look at the British economic, cultural, constitutional organism, It is being damaged at every single level by the Human Rights Act, including in the way benefits are handled and tax breaks are given. We are rewarding all the wrong people in this country. And if Reform wants to form the next government, it needs to acquaint itself with the entire framework of what's going on and understand where policies need to be delivered in order to save this country. On that note, you know that I'm setting up a political party and I'm making good progress there. And we certainly will have joined up thinking when it comes to protecting British citizenry, promoting British national interest, protecting British civil society. And we will do it without expending in any way whatsoever the principles of the protection of humanity. They are not mutually exclusive. It's just about finding the right balance, and we will find it. Thank you very much, folks, for listening this morning.